What is up, everyone? Today, I wanted to give you 10 tips. Yes, 10 tips on how you can get better and more cinematic drone shots. Well, I think we should just jump right into it and start off with number one, and that is maybe something that might be kind of simple or obvious, but that's plan your shots. Drones don't really have the longest battery life, with most of them kind of maxing out at 28, maybe 30 minutes. And so if you're not careful with what you're planning to shoot and what you want to shoot, and you're just shooting your drone up there and hoping to figure out, what to grab when you're up there, you could run out of battery and not get the shots that you really want, or the shots that you were thinking of grabbing. So number one, pretty simple, is just plan ahead. Make sure you know which shots you want to get, the ideas that you have, and just plan it out before you toss the drone up in the sky and start flying and eating up that battery. Number two is use an ND filter. Now, I've talked about this with just filming in general, but it's really important with drone filmmaking as well. So if you don't know, an ND filter just stands for a neutral density filter, and it's basically just sunglasses for your camera. Keeping up with that 180-degree shutter rule, meaning that you just have your shutter speed double whatever your frame rate is, gives you that nice cinematic motion blur, meaning that nice cinematic footage. It's what's most pleasing to the eye when it comes to frame rates and shutter speeds. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, which is kind of the cinematic standard, then you've got your shutter speed at 50 or 48, depending on what kind of camera you have. But when it does come to that drone filmmaking, getting those drone shots, you're gonna wanna keep that 180-degree shutter rule in effect. And so when it's bright outside, just putting on that ND filter allows you to keep that rule in place, just to get the most cinematic looking footage that you possibly can. Keeping on trend with the idea of exposure is number three. Make sure to shoot at the best possible times. And so because drones don't have the biggest sensor, and that kind of results in not the greatest dynamic range, although drones are getting a lot better, and what different companies are putting out is getting pretty amazing. Still, you're gonna wanna shoot in the best possible light. And so I think that's sunset, sunrise, and when it's kind of a cloudy or overcast day. That's where the shadows aren't gonna be harsh, the light's not gonna be harsh and causing you to have overexposed footage. So make sure that you're just picking the best possible times so that your camera, your drone, doesn't really have to struggle to get, to pick up both the highlights and the shadows. Everything just looks nice and visually pleasing to the eye. So again, sunrise, sunset, and overcast, foggy, cloudy days are perfect, and perfect lighting situations to get those drone shots. Continuing on with this trend is number four, and that's to adjust your picture profile. To put it simply, a picture profile is just a menu where you can adjust and change different settings that determine an image's characteristics. So that could be lots of contrast, or lots of sharpness, lots of saturation. And so right out of the box, most drones are gonna have sharpening up, their contrast up, and saturation up. And when it comes to creating a cinematic image, anything that's desaturated or having a log profile, again, it just means that everything is really desaturated. That's what's going to allow you to bring out the best in your image in post later on. And so having a flat picture profile with not a lot of contrast, sharpness, saturation, that's what's going to give your image a lot of dynamic range to pick up those highlights and those shadows and then bring them out in post. And just to be able to play around with your image a lot better and a lot easier in post. So make sure that before you fly, you change your settings to having that desaturated look. I prefer to use the D Cinelike profile just because I feel like it's still a nice desaturated look while still being able to bring out a lot more in post than just your natural or normal look that the Phantom is set on. So that's just my personal opinion. A lot of people use D-Log or just having a neutral look, but I prefer the D Cinelike. Number 5, getting into kind of motion and different shots that you can create. This one, again, maybe it's obvious, maybe it's what you do already, but it's just take everything slow. Make sure that you're doing slow movements. So a lot of people, when they first jump on a drone, they just go insane with the thumbs, and it just creates a really choppy and unprofessional looking image. So just make sure that you're using slow, controlled movements, like when you're panning up or panning down to get a shot below. The slower you get, the more smooth and buttery it looks, and again, the more professional and the more cinematic it looks. Another thing you can do is just put it into slow motion, so shooting at 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second. Number 6 is fly close to objects you're flying over or around. I know this might seem a little counterintuitive, but the closer you fly to something, the more engaging and the more dynamic it actually makes your shot. And so instead of just shooting way up above or just getting, huge scaled shots, getting up close and zooming by a tree or a building or, even a person can make that shot really dynamic and really engaging and bring your audience in. Make sure that when you're doing this, you are being safe and you're following all of the rules and regulations in your specific town or country or state or province or wherever it is that you live. So make sure you're flying safe and according to the rules. But if you're able to fly, maybe it's over a tree or through something, it just, again, ups that production value, brings in that cinematic quality, and brings your audience in and really engages them. Number 7 is kind of the exact opposite of what I was just saying. Use scale. And so this is something that I feel like often gets overlooked. Usually when you're flying a drone, you want to get up close and personal with whatever it is, your subject that you're filming. But being able to just bring it back and just being able to see the expanse of whatever it is that you're filming, again, gives that audience that sense of awe and wonder at how big the landscape is and how small the subject is. So make sure you're using scale to your advantage with things that people can relate to, that makes them say, like, wow, that is huge. This place is just enormous. Making that landscape feel how big it actually is again something that just engages the audience and brings them into the film and the story that you're trying to create. So this actually brings us directly into tip number 8, and that's to include people into your shot. So a lot of times drones are just used for landscape photography, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's amazing. You're really able to see the landscape and see your surroundings in ways that we wouldn't have been able to do, years ago without a helicopter. And so getting shots of the landscape is amazing. But if you add somebody into that shot, not only are you then going to get that scale that we just talked about, but having a person in there really brings your audience into the film that you're creating. And whenever telling a story is always key, and bringing up emotions is always so important. And so when people see other people in a film, they automatically kind of put themselves in there and they can relate. And so when you have your subject in there, it doesn't have to necessarily be a person. It could be a vehicle as well, but something where people can relate to it and they can put themselves in that situation and be amazed by the content that you're creating because that person is in your shot. So number 8, try and add people into your drone shots to just, again, make it more engaging and be able to tell that story in an effective way. Number 9 is playing around with scale and adding in that awesome dolly zoom or that vertigo effect. And so I always recommend shooting in 4K so that you can edit and play around with stuff in post. And so with this dolly zoom, all you're doing, it's super easy, is when your drone is moving forward, you're zooming outward in post. And it just creates this really cool vertigo or dolly zoom effect that, again, just makes your footage more dynamic and causes your audience to become more engaged and more interested in your shot. And so you can play around with different effects in post. You can do the opposite if you're moving back, zooming in, or just simply zooming in nice and slow when you're moving in on a shot. And so it's just something that adds just a little bit extra and creates that cinematic effect. Make sure that you're not overdoing it and just zooming in like crazy. Like we mentioned before, you want to keep everything smooth and buttery and just controlled motions. It's what really gives it that professional and cinematic look. Tip number 10, we have gotten to the end, and this is to color correct and color match all of your footage. So many times when shooting on a different camera and including drone footage, the drone footage can just look very different from what you're shooting on your camera. And so to make sure that your footage looks cinematic and professional, you want to make sure that you're color correcting and grading and matching footage from your camera and your drone, just to give your story that cohesive look. You don't want this jarring effect where you can really tell that this was a different camera. You want everything to just feel seamless and smooth and effortless when you're watching or having people watch your film. So again, it just helps with storytelling, just so that the viewer isn't kind of taken aback or they notice those things. You want to make sure that when somebody's watching your story, when you're telling your story, that everything just flows smoothly and seamlessly. So thank you guys so much for watching, for taking in these tips. Let me know in the comments below if you've done any of these or if there's maybe some that I missed. Let me know too if there's any other tutorials or tips or tricks that you would like me to go over. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff if you haven't already. It really does make a difference, and I'll see you on the next video.